Chapter 1. The Call That Shouldn't Exist. The call came at 11:47 p.m. Paul Harper noticed the time first, not the number. Unknown calls that late were either bad news or deliberate interruptions. Old habits from intelligence work never left him. He let the phone ring twice while his eyes scanned the dark living room, the silent security monitors glowing faintly against the wall. Nothing out of place. No alerts. No breaches. He answered. "Mr. Paul Harper?" a woman asked. Her voice was professional but strained, as if stretched too thin over something fragile. "This is Paul," he said evenly. "This is St. Mary's General Hospital. I'm calling regarding your son. He's been in a serious car accident. You're listed as his emergency contact." The words landed wrong. Not shocking, impossible. Paul didn't raise his voice. He didn't pause either. "You have the wrong person," he said. "I don't have a son." There was a brief silence on the line, filled with distant beeping and muffled hospital noise. Then the woman spoke again, quieter now. "Sir, his name is Troy Harper. He was admitted unconscious about an hour ago. His injuries are critical, and I'm infertile," Paul interrupted. He stood up without realizing it, his bare feet pressing into the cold marble floor. "Medically confirmed. I've never had children. Check your records again." Another pause. Longer this time. I've checked them," the nurse said. Her voice trembled just slightly. "Your name, your number, your signature. You're listed as his father. That's not possible." "I know how this sounds," she whispered, and the word whispered was what unsettled him most. "But please, Mr. Harper, you have to come in." Paul closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. In that sliver of darkness, his mind ran probabilities the way it always had. Error, fraud, prank, misdirection. Someone phishing. Someone testing. Someone stupid. "Who gave you my number?" he asked. It was in his wallet, along with a photo. "Of you." Paul opened his eyes. "Is he conscious?" he asked. "No, not fully. He keeps drifting in and out." Paul ended the call without saying goodbye. He stood there for a long moment, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the deadline. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass wall, gray at the temples, face carved by discipline and years of restraint. A man who had survived ambushes, interrogations, betrayals. A man who did not believe in coincidence. Carrie was asleep upstairs. He didn't wake her. He dressed with mechanical precision, holstered his sidearm out of habit, then removed it. Hospitals didn't allow weapons, and tonight was not about force. It was about confirmation. The drive to St. Mary's took 17 minutes. He remembered because he counted everyone. The city blurred past, streetlights streaking across the windshield. His mind kept circling the same impossible fact, trying to break it down, dismantle it, expose the flaw. He'd been diagnosed infertile at 28 after shrapnel damage during a classified operation. Multiple tests, multiple specialists, no margin for error, no son. Yet his pulse had quickened anyway. The hospital parking garage smelled of oil and disinfectant. Paul parked, exited, and scanned instinctively, faces, cameras, exits. Nothing unusual. Still, unease crawled under his skin. At the front desk, he gave his name. The receptionist looked up, then immediately softened. "They're expecting you," she said. That was worse. A young nurse met him near the elevators. She couldn't have been older than 25, her badge clipped on crookedly, hands fidgeting with a tablet. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded and turned quickly, as if afraid he might vanish. "I see you. This way." The elevator ride was silent except for the hum of machinery. Paul watched the numbers climb. The nurse avoided his eyes. "You said his name is Troy," Paul said. "Yes." "How old is he?" 23. Paul's jaw tightened. 23 years ago, he'd been deployed overseas, in and out of conflict zones, living out of duffel bags and safe houses. No relationships, no time, no opportunity, no child. The ICU doors slid open with a soft hiss. The air changed instantly, sterile, heavy, humming with machines that kept people hovering between existence and absence. They stopped outside a glass-walled room. "He's in here," the nurse said. She hesitated, then added, "I'll give you a moment." Paul stepped forward. The first thing he noticed was the bandages. The second was the bruising. The third was the face. He stopped. The young man lying in the hospital bed looked like him. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Identical. Same jawline. Same straight nose with the faint ridge along the bridge. Same brow shape. Even the scar above the right eyebrow, Paul's scar, earned during a close-quarters extraction in Sarajevo, was there, faint but unmistakable. Paul's breath slowed deliberately. Panic was a luxury he never allowed himself. He stepped closer to the bed. Monitors beeped softly. Tubes ran from the young man's arms. His chest rose and fell shallowly. His hair was darker than Paul's had been at that age, but the structure beneath, it was undeniable. "This is not real," Paul murmured. The nurse hovered near the door. "He's been stable for the last 20 minutes. Paul didn't respond. He was studying details now: ear shape, cheekbones, the exact spacing of the eyes. Genetic markers burned into bone. "This is some kind of mistake," he said louder. "Or a setup." The nurse swallowed. "He had your photo in his wallet, sir. Worn, like he carried it for a long time." Paul straightened. "Where did he get it?" "I don't know." Paul looked down at the unconscious young man again. "Who told him my name?" The nurse shook her head. "He hasn't said much. Just when he came to briefly in the ambulance, he kept asking if you'd been called." Paul's fists clenched at his sides. "Why?" he asked. The nurse hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because he said you're his father." Paul let out a breath through his nose. "That's impossible." "I know," she said softly. As if summoned by the tension in the room, the young man stirred. His fingers twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Paul froze. "Troy," the nurse whispered, stepping closer. The young man's eyes opened just enough to reveal a familiar gray-blue stare. Confused. Searching. They landed on Paul. Recognition flickered there. Relief. Something deeper. "Dad," he whispered. The word hit Paul harder than any bullet ever had. His world fractured right there. Chapter 2. A Son with His Face. Paul did not leave the hospital that night. He stood beside the bed long after the nurse dimmed the lights, long after the ICU quieted into its artificial rhythm of beeping monitors and whispered footsteps. He stood because sitting felt like surrender and leaving felt like something he might never come back from. The young man slept unevenly, breath hitching now and then, as if his body couldn't decide whether to keep going. Up close, the resemblance was even more disturbing. The shape of the mouth, the crease that formed between the brows when he frowned in his sleep. Paul had seen that face before, every morning in the mirror. When dawn crept through the narrow ICU windows, the young man stirred again. Paul straightened instinctively. His eyes opened slowly this time, unfocused at first. He winced, tried to move, then stopped when pain caught up with him. His gaze drifted until it locked onto Paul's face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You're really here," the young man said hoarsely. Paul crossed his arms. "You said my name last night." The young man swallowed. "Paul Harper." "Yes. You didn't correct me when I called you Dad." Paul's jaw tightened. "I was making sure you were conscious." The young man nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "They told me you might not come." "Why would they say that?" "Because you don't believe I exist." Paul leaned forward slightly. "That depends on what you tell me next." The young man exhaled, eyes closing for a second. "My name is Troy Harper." Paul waited. "My mom, her name was Evelyn," Troy continued. "She died 6 months ago. Cancer. Before the end, she told me everything. She said she'd been keeping a secret my whole life." Paul watched his face, not listening for emotion, but for inconsistencies. Stress patterns. Fabrication tells. He saw grief, fear, resolve. Nothing theatrical. "She said you didn't know about me," Troy went on. "That you were deployed. That she didn't want to ruin your life." Paul said nothing. "She told me your name. Where you grew up. That you hated the smell of cigarette smoke because your father used to chain smoke in the garage." Troy hesitated, then added quietly, "She said you learned to tie knots before you learned to ride a bike. Navy-style knots. Because you like control." Paul's eyes flicked up. That detail had never been written anywhere. Troy watched the reaction and nodded faintly. "She said a lot of things like that. Things I couldn't have Googled." Paul straightened. "People fabricate convincing lies all the time." I know, Troy said. I didn't believe her at first either. Paul turned away, pacing once across the room. Then why are you here? Because she gave me your photo, Troy said, and your number. And she made me promise that if anything ever happened to me, I'd call you. Paul stopped. You were carrying my photo? Yes. Why? Troy met his eyes. Because she said one day I'd look at it and understand why she loved you. Silence filled the room. Paul pressed his fingers into his temple. He had interrogated war criminals, dismantled elaborate covers, watched people crumble under scrutiny. Yet nothing in his training prepared him for this. An impossible story delivered without theatrics. I'm ordering a DNA test, Paul said finally. Troy nodded. I expected that. If it comes back negative, this ends. Troy's expression didn't change. And if it doesn't? Paul didn't answer. The test was ordered within the hour. Paul insisted on overseeing the chain of custody himself. Separate samples. Independent lab. No hospital shortcuts. The doctors exchanged looks, but complied. Something about the way Paul spoke, measured, unyielding, discouraged questions. While Troy was taken for imaging, Paul stepped into the hallway and called home. Carrie answered on the third ring. You didn't come to bed, she said. I'm at St. Mary's. There was a pause. Are you hurt? No, another pause. Slightly longer this time. Then why are you there? Paul considered lying. He decided not to. They called me. About an accident. I didn't know you knew anyone. They said it was my son. The silence that followed was absolute. That's not funny, Carrie said finally. I know. Paul listened to her breathing. I'll explain when I get home, she said. Too quickly. Just be careful. The line went dead before he could respond. Paul stared at the phone, unease settling deeper. Carrie had always been steady, curious. She asked questions. Tonight, she hadn't asked any. When Troy returned, groggy but alert, Paul resumed his watch. You ever wonder why she waited so long to tell you? Paul asked. All the time, Troy said. She said she was afraid. That you'd disappear again. Paul nodded slowly. She was right about one thing. Fear makes people do strange things. Hours passed. Morning turned to afternoon. Doctors came and went. Troy slept. The results arrived just after sunset. Paul took the envelope himself. He didn't open it immediately. He stood in an empty consultation room, lights humming overhead, his reflection faint in the glass cabinet door. He had faced death without flinching. This felt worse. He opened the envelope. The words blurred for half a second before his eyes adjusted. Probability of paternity. 99.7%. Paul read it again. And again. No, he said aloud. He walked back into Troy's room slowly, the paper folded in his hand. Troy was awake, watching the door like he'd been waiting. You got the results, Troy said. Paul placed the paper on the tray table between them. Explain this. Troy read it. His hands trembled. I told you. This shouldn't be possible, Paul said. I'm infertile. I don't know what to tell you. Paul studied him carefully now, not as a potential liar, but as a variable that didn't belong in any model. His disbelief didn't fade. It sharpened. That night, Paul went home. Carrie was in the kitchen, phone face down on the counter. She looked up too late, as if she hadn't heard him enter. You're back early, she said. It's midnight. Oh, she forced a smile. I lost track of time. Paul kissed her cheek. She smelled faintly of perfume she rarely wore. Who are you talking to? He asked casually. Work, she said too fast. Client stuff. Paul nodded, opening the fridge. He watched her reflection in the stainless steel door. She didn't meet his eyes. Later, as she slept, Paul lay awake. A son with his face. A test that couldn't be right. A wife who suddenly felt like a stranger. His instincts, sharpened by decades and intelligence, whispered the same warning over and over. This was not coincidence. Chapter 3, Ghosts in the Records. Paul Harper did not confront problems head-on anymore. That was the man he used to be, the soldier, the interrogator, the hammer. Now, when something didn't make sense, he stepped back and let it reveal itself. Patterns always did. 3 days after the hospital, Paul sat alone in his home office before dawn, a single lamp burning, screens dark. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the security system. Carrie was still asleep upstairs, or pretending to be. Paul slid his phone from his pocket and tapped a familiar, encrypted number. Don answered on the second ring. "It's early," he said. "That means it's bad." "I need you," Paul replied. "Off the books." A pause. "You already know the answer." "Talk." Paul explained everything. The call, the ICU, the face, the DNA. Don didn't interrupt once. When Paul finished, Don exhaled slowly. "You understand how impossible this sounds." "I understand it better than anyone." "Send me everything you have," Don said. "Names, dates, especially the mother." Paul ended the call and stared at the dark screen for a moment before sending the files. By noon, Don called back. "She's a ghost," Don said without preamble. Paul was standing at the hospital window, watching traffic crawl below. Define ghost. No employment records under the name Evelyn Harper. No tax filings. No rental history longer than 6 months anywhere. Medical records exist, but they are thin, like someone created them backward. Paul closed his eyes. Meaning the data exists, but it doesn't connect to anything else. No doctor references. No insurance trail that makes sense. No social footprint before 25 years ago. Paul turned back toward the room where Troy sat scrolling aimlessly through his phone. What about the address she gave him? Burner apartment. Paid cash. Lease under a shell LLC that dissolved 8 years ago. Paul felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Someone wanted her untraceable. Or wanted you confused, Don said. "Which do you think?" Paul didn't answer. He watched Troy from across the room. The young man laughed quietly at something on his screen, then winced and adjusted the 4-line. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Paul entered the room. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Doctors say I'm lucky," Troy replied. "No spinal damage. Few weeks, and I'll be mobile again." Paul nodded, pulling a chair closer. "Tell me about your childhood." Troy blinked. "You've already asked that. I want to hear it again." Troy hesitated, then shrugged. "Small towns mostly. We moved a lot. Mom said she didn't like staying in one place too long." "Why?" "She said it made her anxious." Paul leaned forward. "What did she do for work?" "She said she freelanced. Consulting. Stuff like that." "What kind of consulting?" Troy frowned. "I never asked." Paul watched his face carefully. The slight tightening around the mouth. The delayed blink. "What was her doctor's name?" Paul asked. I don't remember," Troy said. "There were a few." Paul nodded slowly. "You said she got sick quickly." "Yeah. Late diagnosis." "What hospital treated her?" Troy shifted in the bed. "It was somewhere in Nevada." "I think." "You think," Paul repeated. Troy met his gaze. "Why are you doing this?" Paul didn't soften his voice. "Because people who tell the truth remember details, even painful ones." Troy swallowed. His pulse jumped visibly at his neck. "I'm not lying to you," he said. "I didn't say you were," Paul replied. "I said things don't line up." Troy looked away. Paul stood and left without another word. That evening, Paul went home earlier than usual. Carrie was in the living room. Phone pressed to her ear, back turned. She stiffened when she saw him. "I'll call you back," she said quickly, ending the call. Paul loosened his tie. "Who was that?" "Work," she said. "You've been asking that a lot." Paul smiled faintly. "You've been answering it differently every time." Carrie crossed her arms. "You're acting strange." "Funny," Paul replied. "I was thinking the same thing." She didn't respond. Later that night, while Carrie showered, Paul accessed the house's internal network and pulled the phone metadata. He didn't read messages. He didn't need to. Numbers told stories if you listened. One number appeared again and again. Burned. Unregistered. He sent it to Dawn. Minutes later, the response came back. Alex Browning. Paul's jaw tightened. Browning had been dirty for years. A private investigator who sold information to the highest bidder and buried whatever didn't fit. Paul had crossed paths with him once long ago. He hadn't liked him then either. Dawn called. "She's meeting him," Dawn said. "Not calling. In person." "When?" "Twice last week. Once yesterday. Coffee shop near the river. Same bench. Same time." Paul closed his eyes briefly. "Follow." "I didn't need to." He didn't bother hiding. Paul said nothing. The next morning, Paul returned to the hospital earlier than planned. Troy was already awake, staring at the ceiling. "You didn't say goodbye last night," Troy said. "I wasn't finished listening," Paul replied. Troy sat up slightly. You think I'm part of something. I think you're in the middle of something, Paul corrected. Troy studied him. You don't trust anyone, do you? Paul considered that. I trust patterns. He watched Troy speak now, not for words but for rhythm. Stress leaks through the body when the mind tries to keep secrets. Troy's hands moved too much when he spoke about his mother, too little when he spoke about himself. Did anyone ever ask you to pretend? Paul asked suddenly. Troy froze. Pretend what? Anything. No, Paul nodded. Good. He left again, unease coiling tighter. That afternoon, Don sent another message. You're not imagining this. Someone accessed sealed Bosnia-era files last month. Your name came up. Paul stared at the words. Bosnia, a file he hadn't thought about in years. A mission buried so deep it wasn't supposed to exist anymore. He locked his phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. A son who shouldn't exist. A mother who left no footprints. A wife meeting a man who thrived on secrets. And classified ghosts stirring where they should have stayed dead. Someone, somewhere, was pulling threads connected to Paul Harper's buried intelligence history. And they were doing it carefully. Chapter 4. The Bosnia file reopens. The file hadn't been opened in 17 years. Paul knew that because he had personally sealed it. He sat in Don's basement office, the kind of place built for secrets. No windows, concrete walls, old server racks humming softly like sleeping animals. Don stood at the workstation, arms folded, eyes narrowed at the screen. Someone filed a classified inquiry, Don said. Not a leak, not a breach, a legitimate request, routed through proper channels. Paul leaned forward. On what authority? That's the problem, Don replied. The authority is buried under 3 layers of clearance and 2 shell oversight committees. Whoever did this knew exactly where to touch without leaving fingerprints. The screen displayed a familiar code string. Paul didn't need to read the title. Bosnia, Sarajevo sector, chemical seizure. They were destroyed, Paul said flatly. That's what the report says, Don answered. That's what you wrote. Paul stared at the screen, jaw tight. And now someone's asking for confirmation. Inventory logs, transport routes, post-destruction verification. Paul leaned back slowly. That file was untouchable. Not anymore. Silence settled between them, heavy and old. Don broke it first. This doesn't start with Troy. Paul nodded. No, Troy is the hook. They drove to the hospital together. Paul didn't tell Troy they were coming. He wanted to see him unprepared. Troy was sitting upright when Paul entered, scrolling on his phone. He looked up and smiled faintly, then noticed Don behind him and stiffened. Who's your friend? Troy asked. Paul pulled a chair close. Someone who asks better questions than I do. Don nodded once. Troy, do I know you? Troy asked. No, Don said, but I know a lot about you. Troy's smile faded. Paul leaned in. Tell me about the accident. Troy blinked. I already did. Tell me again, Paul said calmly. This time slowly. Troy exhaled. I was driving back from Reno. It was raining. A truck wrong, Don said. Troy froze. What? The truck never existed, Don continued. No commercial vehicle reported. No debris pattern consistent with impact. Your car was sideswiped deliberately at low speed, forced into the median. Troy stared at him. That's not. The skid marks tell the story, Paul said quietly. You were hit, not surprised. Troy shook his head. I didn't know that. Paul watched his pulse spike. Not guilt. Shock. Who told you to go to Reno? Paul asked. No one, Troy said. I want to meet someone. Paul's eyes narrowed. Who? Troy hesitated. A journalist. Don raised an eyebrow. Name? She said her name was Lena Cross. Don's fingers flew over the keyboard on his tablet. No such journalist. No bylines. No credentials. Social media account created 9 months ago. Troy's face drained of color. She contacted me after my mom died. Troy said slowly. Said she was investigating you. Paul said nothing. She told me you didn't know about me. Troy continued. That people were watching you. That I had to be careful. Paul's voice hardened. Careful of what? She said there were men from your past. Troy whispered. That if they knew I existed, they might come after me. Don looked at Paul. Classic grooming. Troy's hands began to shake. She told me to carry your photo. Said it would protect me. Paul stood abruptly. Get a CT scan, he said to the nurse outside. Full craniofacial review. Now. Troy looked up. What? Paul didn't answer. The results came back an hour later. Don studied the images first. His expression changed. Jesus, he murmured. Paul stepped closer. He didn't need medical training to see it. Subtle modifications. Bone smoothing along the jaw. Minor orbital reshaping. Adjustments so precise they blended into natural anatomy. Facial reconstruction, Don said. High-end. Not cosmetic. Mimetic. To look like me, Paul said. Troy stared at the screen, horrified. I didn't have surgery. You did, Don said gently. Years ago. Probably told it was corrective. Sinus. Trauma. Troy pressed his hands to his face. I was 12. I broke my nose. Mom said it was bad. Paul felt something cold settle in his chest. They didn't change your face, Don said. They guided it. Small alterations over time. Troy's breathing became erratic. She wasn't acting alone, Paul said. Troy looked up, eyes glassy. You think my mother did this to me? I think she was part of something bigger, Paul replied. And I think she was scared. Don's phone buzzed. DNA results are back, he said. Paul didn't look away from Troy. Read them. Same as before, Don said quietly. 99.7% match. Troy laughed weakly. See? Paul shook his head. No, he turned to Don. Chain of custody? Compromise, Don admitted. Lab contractor ties back to a private firm. Paul's eyes hardened. Which one? Don showed him the screen. Paul recognized the name instantly. Alex Browning. Troy covered his mouth. That's the man my mom warned me about. Paul looked at him sharply. She warned you about him? Yes. She said he'd twist things, that he couldn't be trusted. Paul exhaled slowly. Then why did you meet him? I didn't know it was him, Troy said, tears forming. The journalist, she said she needed help verifying records. She said Browning had answers. The dam broke. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Troy choked. I just wanted to know who I was. Paul watched him collapse inward, shoulders shaking, hands trembling like a child's. He waited until Troy looked up again. You're not my biological son, Paul said. The words landed hard. Troy flinched. I knew it, he whispered. But you were made to look like me, Paul continued. You were fed truths mixed with lies. Positioned. Used. Troy nodded, tears falling freely now. So what am I? Paul held his gaze. A pawn, he said quietly. And he meant it. Chapter 5. The enemy steps forward. The name surfaced at 2:14 a.m. Paul was awake, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, security feeds cycling silently across the wall monitor. He hadn't slept. Sleep required the illusion of safety, and that illusion had evaporated days ago. His phone vibrated once. Don. I found him. Paul didn't need to ask who. He called immediately. Omar Sutton, Don said without greeting. Confirmed. Not rumor. Not speculation. Paul closed his eyes. The name carried weight, old weight, the kind that settled in the bones and never left. He's supposed to be rotting in a black site prison, Paul said. He was, Don replied. Until 18 months ago. Quiet transfer. Sentence commuted under sealed authority. No press. No record. Paul's jaw tightened. For what? Officially? Cooperation. Paul snorted softly. Unofficially? Someone needed a monster with reach, Don said. And Sutton has both. Paul stood and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood slept, neat houses, trim lawns, soft yellow streetlights. A picture of normalcy that now felt fragile. He hates me, Paul said. He doesn't just hate you, Don replied. He blames you. Paul remembered Sutton vividly. The courtroom, the glare of pure venom. The promise whispered as guards dragged him away. I'll take everything from you. Where is he now? Paul asked. Moving, Don said. Dubai, Prague, Buenos Aires. Money everywhere. Weapons deals that don't touch paper. Paul exhaled slowly. That explains the resources. It explains some of them, Don said. Not all. The line went quiet for a beat. Paul, Don added, you're being tested. As if on cue, one of the exterior cameras flickered. Paul's eyes snapped to the screen. What is that? Don asked. Paul didn't answer. He was already moving. The feed stabilized. Nothing obvious. Just a man walking a dog past the house. Normal. Too normal. Send me everything you have on Sutton's movements, Paul said, and start digging into Browning again. Hard. He's been laying low, Don replied. Which means I know, Paul said. It won't last. It didn't. Alex Browning died the next afternoon. Paul heard about it from Don, not the news. Single gunshot, Don said. Close range. No struggle. Professional. Where? Parking garage. Downtown. Middle of the day. Paul leaned back his chair, eyes on the ceiling. Message received. Someone's cleaning house, Don said. And Browning was expendable. Paul pictured Browning's smug grin, the way he trafficked in secrets like currency. He knew too much, Paul said, and not enough to save himself. The first probe came that night. Paul was returning from the hospital with Troy when the traffic light ahead turned red. He stopped, scanning mirrors out of habit. The car behind him rolled forward, then stopped too close. Another vehicle eased in on the left. Paul's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Troy, he said calmly, brace. What? The rear car bumped them. Not hard. Enough to jolt. Paul hit the accelerator, swerving through the intersection as the light changed. Horns blared. Tires screamed. The car on the left lunged forward, blocking, but Paul cut sharply, scraping paint and forcing through. They were clear within seconds. Paul didn't slow until they reached a crowded boulevard. Troy was breathing hard. That wasn't an accident. No, Paul said. It was a question. What question? How close they can get. Paul dropped Troy at the hospital entrance and waited until he was inside before driving home a different route. By morning, Don confirmed it. Sutton's men, he said. Low-level contractors. Testing response time. Paul stood in his armory room, methodically checking equipment. Then we're past coincidence. We passed that days ago, Don replied. This is escalation. Paul closed the case and looked up. How long until they push harder? Soon, Don said. Sutton doesn't like patience. Neither did Paul. He went to the hospital immediately. Troy was sitting up, watching the door as if expecting trouble. You look like hell, Troy said. Paul almost smiled. You should see the other guy. Troy hesitated. I heard about Browning. Paul studied him. From who? News alert, Troy said. They called it a robbery. Paul nodded. It wasn't. Troy swallowed. Is this because of me? No, Paul said firmly. This started long before you. But I'm part of it now. Paul didn't deny that. We're leaving, Paul said. Today, Troy blinked. Leaving where? Somewhere safer. Troy's hands tightened on the blanket. Are they coming here? Paul held his gaze. Eventually, that was enough. Don met them at a service exit with a nondescript SUV. He took one look at Troy and nodded. You ready for a field trip? Don asked. Troy forced a weak smile. Do I get a say? Paul answered for him. No, they drove for hours, trading city for highway, highway for winding mountain roads. Paul stayed alert, checking mirrors, varying speed, never settling into a pattern. As dusk fell, the cabin emerged from the trees, weathered wood, reinforced steel, satellite dishes disguised as vents. It wasn't on any map. Paul had built it years ago and hoped never to use it. Don whistled softly. Still paranoid, I see. Paul keyed in the access code. Still alive. Inside, the cabin was all function. Supplies. Communications. Redundant power. Troy looked around slowly. This is a lot. It's temporary, Paul said. For how long? Paul didn't answer. Don stepped aside as Paul secured the door. Sutton won't stop, Don said quietly. You know that. I know, Paul replied. And Troy. Paul glanced at him. The young man stood awkwardly near the fireplace, trying not to touch anything, eyes full of questions he didn't ask. He's involved whether he wants to be or not, Don continued. You could send him away. Paul shook his head. Why not? Don asked. Paul's voice was low, steady. Because that's what they'd expect. Don studied him. This isn't about strategy, is it? Paul didn't look away from Troy. It is, he said. Just not the kind you're thinking. He walked over to Troy and placed a hand on his shoulder. Listen to me, Paul said. From this moment on, you don't go anywhere without one of us. You follow instructions. No questions when it matters. Troy nodded. Okay. Paul's grip tightened slightly. And understand this, he added. Blood or not, you're under my protection now. Troy's throat worked. Why? Paul met his eyes. Because someone decided to use you, he said. And I don't allow that. And that decision settled into place, quiet, irrevocable, just as Sutton's shadow closed in. Chapter 6, Carrie vanishes. The cabin woke Paul before dawn. Not with sound, with absence. He lay still, counting. Wind against the pines. Generator hummed steady. No alerts. No footsteps. The quiet felt staged, like a held breath. Paul slid from the bed and checked the perimeter screens. All green. Then his phone vibrated once. A blocked number. Paul answered without speaking. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," a man said, voice smooth and unhurried. "I trust the mountain air agrees with you." Paul closed his eyes. He knew the voice. It carried the same oily confidence it had in the courtroom years ago. "Sutton," Paul said. A soft chuckle. "You always were quick. Where's my wife?" "Straight to business," Sutton replied. "I respect that. She's comfortable as circumstances allow." Paul felt the world narrow. "You touch her and what?" Sutton interrupted gently. "You'll kill me?" "You already tried once, Paul. It didn't take." Paul breathed slowly through his nose. "What do you want?" "The truth," Sutton said. "About Sarajevo." Paul said nothing. "You see," Sutton continued, "I believe you kept something valuable. Something you told the world was destroyed." "There was nothing left," Paul said. Sutton laughed. "You're a terrible liar when you're emotional." Paul ended the call. He stood there for a long moment, phone heavy in his hand, then turned toward the other room. Troy was already awake. He stood barefoot near the window, watching the tree lean, shoulders tense. "I heard your voice," he said quietly. "That wasn't Dawn." "No," Paul replied. "It wasn't." Troy swallowed. "It's Carrie." Paul nodded once. "She's been taken." Troy's jaw tightened. "Because of me?" "No," Paul said firmly. "Because of me." Dawn emerged from the back room, pulling on a jacket. He took one look at Paul's face and didn't ask questions. "Sutton," Dawn said. "Yes." Dawn cursed under his breath. He moved fast, faster than expected. "What does he want?" Paul's eyes were hard. "He thinks I kept the Sarajevo cash." Dawn stared. "That's insane." "It's convenient," Paul replied. "And he thinks Carrie gives him leverage." Dawn glanced at Troy. "He's not wrong about that part." Paul didn't respond. They spent the next hour locking the cabin down. Sensors recalibrated. Escape routes reviewed. Paul moved with controlled urgency, every action precise. "Sit," Paul told Troy, tossing him a pair of gloves. Troy caught them. "What we doing?" "Seeing what you remember under pressure." Paul led him to the cleared space near the back of the cabin. The floor was reinforced steel beneath worn wood. "Rules," Paul said. "No hesitation. No excuses." He tossed Troy a rubber training knife without warning. Troy fumbled, barely catching it. Paul lunged. Troy barely reacted in time, stumbling back as Paul's hand brushed his shoulder. "You're dead," Paul said calmly. Again, Troy grimaced. "I'm not trained." "You're alive," Paul replied. "That's training enough." They went again. Paul attacked faster this time. Troy blocked clumsily, dropped the knife, but didn't freeze. He moved, adapted, shoved off the wall, and created space. Paul stopped. "Why did you move left?" Paul asked. Troy panted. "Because you favor your right." Paul's eyes flicked up. "How do you know that?" "I've been watching you," Troy said. "Since the hospital." Paul nodded slowly. They trained until Troy's arms shook and sweat soaked through his shirt. Each time he fell, he got up faster. "Enough," Paul said finally. Troy leaned over, hands on knees. "Did I pass?" Paul handed him water. "You didn't break." That night, Sutton called again. This time, Paul put him on speaker. "You're being unreasonable," Sutton said pleasantly. "I've given you proof of life. I can give you more." Paul's jaw tightened. "What proof?" A muffled sound came through the line. A woman's voice, frightened, unmistakable. "Paul," Carrie whispered. The sound cut off. Paul's knuckles went white around the phone. "You have 48 hours, Sutton said. "Tell me where the cash is, or I start removing incentives." Paul's voice was ice. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly," Sutton replied. "You think this is about revenge. It's not. It's about inventory." The line went dead. Don exhaled slowly. He's convinced it exists. And that I hid it, Paul said. Did you? Paul didn't answer immediately. He stared at the wall, eyes distant. I documented what I was ordered to document, he said finally. Nothing more. Don nodded. Then this isn't about truth. It's about belief. Paul turned to Troy, who stood quietly near the doorway. You heard all of that, Paul said. Troy nodded. I'm sorry. Paul shook his head. Don't be. Just listen. He stepped closer. From now on, you do exactly what I say. No heroics. No second-guessing. Troy met his gaze. I won't run. Paul studied him for a long moment, measuring resolve. He saw fear, yes, but also something solid beneath it. Good, Paul said. Because they're watching. Don frowned. You think Sutton's the only one? No, Paul replied. He's the loud one. That makes him useful. For who? Troy asked. Paul didn't answer. He went outside alone, standing beneath the cold stars, listening to the mountains breathe. Somewhere out there, his wife was being held by men who believed he would break. Paul Harper had survived wars, interrogations, betrayals by governments, and ghosts from files that were never meant to reopen. This was different. This was personal. And as he stood there, planning angles and contingencies, one truth settled in his bones with absolute clarity. Every move he made now was being watched by forces far beyond Omar Sutton alone. Chapter 7. The Devil's Bargain. Paul made the call himself. No intermediaries. No burners. No disguises. He used the same block channel Sutton had used, dialing once deliberately, then waiting. Sutton answered on the third ring. You've reconsidered, Sutton said, pleased. Paul leaned against the cabin's steel counter, eyes on the map spread before him. I've calculated. A low laugh. That's more like you. You want Sarajevo, Paul continued. I want my wife. You want absolution, Sutton corrected. You want the past to stay buried. Paul didn't take the bait. You also want your money. Silence. Paul smiled faintly. Your Swiss accounts. Zurich. Basel. The ones you buried under 3 trusts and a debt attorney. The silence deepened, sharpened. You've been busy, Sutton said carefully. I've always been busy, Paul replied. You just forgot. Don stood a few feet away, arms crossed, listening. Troy hovered near the doorway, pretending not to. You're offering me leverage, Sutton said. Why would I trust you? You wouldn't, Paul answered. You'd verify. And if I don't like what I see, Paul's voice was calm. Then you kill Carrie and hunt me until one of us stops breathing. We both know that ends badly for everyone. Another pause. Talk, Sutton said. Paul traced a finger along the map. The cache was never destroyed, where the report says. It was relocated. Temporarily. I can take you to where it was staged. Was, Sutton repeated. Paul didn't correct him. And the money? Sutton pressed. I give you access, Paul said. Keys, routing, authentication phrases. Everything you need to move it. Once Carrie is released. Sutton chuckled. You think I'll give him my leverage first? No, Paul said. I think you'll want a public exchange. Neutral ground. Witnesses. Insurance. Don's eyes flicked up. Denver International Airport. Paul continued. Concourse B. 2 days from now. Noon. You've already planned this, Sutton observed. I don't improvise, Paul said. Sutton considered. Paul could hear it in the rhythm of his breathing. The man liked control. Liked spectacle. You're assuming I believe the cache still exists, Sutton said. I'm assuming you believe I believe it exists, Paul replied. That's enough. A low, appreciative laugh. You really are the same man. Paul's jaw tightened. Do we have a deal? Yes, Sutton said. We do. The line went dead. Paul stayed where he was for a full 10 seconds, listening to the silence, then set the phone down carefully. Don exhaled. You just offered him everything. I offered him what he thinks he wants, Paul replied. Troy stepped forward. You don't think the cache is there? Paul shook his head. I think it was moved years ago. Then why? Because Sutton doesn't need the cache, Paul interrupted. He needs to believe I'm desperate. Don nodded slowly. And Carrie makes that believable. Paul didn't respond. They spent the next hours planning. Not one plan, many. Don mapped airport schematics, service corridors, blind spots. Paul overlaid crowd density projections, security response times. Troy watched, absorbing everything, saying little. You stay out of sight, Paul told him firmly. Troy nodded. I understand. No, Paul corrected. You obey. Troy held his gaze. I will. Paul studied him for a moment, then turned back to the map. They planned for betrayal, for ambush, for Sutton lying, for Sutton telling the truth, for Sutton doing both at once. Paul prepared dead drops of information, some true, some deliberately stale. Coordinates that had once mattered, routes that no longer existed, names that led nowhere. He selected Denver not because it was convenient, but because it was controlled chaos. Too many eyes, too many cameras, too many variables Sutton couldn't fully command. You're counting on his ego, Don said. I'm counting on his certainty, Paul replied. He thinks I'll behave like a man who's already lost. And you're not. Paul's eyes hardened. No, late that night, Paul stood alone on the cabin's porch, cold air biting at his skin. He stared at the stars, letting the noise in his head settle into clean lines. Carrie's face rose unbidden, her smile, her laugh, the quiet way she used to watch him when she thought he wasn't looking. Sutton believed that was weakness. Paul saw it differently. Inside, Troy approached hesitantly. You're really going to walk into this? Yes. And if it goes wrong? Paul didn't look at him. Then it goes wrong. Troy swallowed. You could run. Paul finally turned. That's what Sutton expects me not to do, which makes it useless. Troy nodded slowly. Paul placed a hand on his shoulder. Remember what I told you. This isn't the final layer. Troy frowned. Then what is it? Paul's expression was unreadable. The invitation. And with that, the bargain was set, bait laid in plain sight, contingencies buried beneath contingencies. Paul fully aware that Denver was not the end of the game, only the place where Sutton believed he would finally win. Chapter 8, Blood at the Airport. Denver International Airport breathed like a living thing. Paul felt at the moment he stepped into Concourse B, the press of bodies, the layered noise of rolling luggage and boarding calls, the restless energy of people going somewhere else. Controlled chaos. Exactly as planned. He walked alone, no weapons visible, no earpiece, just a dark coat and a calm expression that Sutton would read as resignation. Sutton's people were already there. Paul spotted them easily once he stopped trying to hide the fact that he was looking. Two near the coffee kiosk pretending to argue about flights, one seated with his back to a pillar, another pacing too deliberately near the windows. Professionals, but not subtle. They wanted to be seen. Paul stopped at the center of the concourse, right beneath the departures board. Sutton emerged a moment later. He looked unchanged, tailored suit, silver hair, smile sharpened by confidence. The kind of man who enjoyed public places because they made him feel untouchable. Paul Harper, Sutton said warmly, arms slightly open. You look tired. Paul didn't smile. Where is she? Sutton gestured with his chin. Carrie was escorted from behind a cluster of maintenance doors, wrists bound loosely, face pale but unmarked. Her eyes found Paul instantly. Paul, she breathed. He took one step forward. Sutton raised a finger. Ah! Paul stopped. She's fine, Sutton said. For now. Paul forced his breathing to remain steady. You have what you want. Do I? Sutton asked. That depends. Paul handed over a slim drive. Access credentials, routing keys, authentication phrases. You can verify them right now. One of Sutton's men took the drive and moved away, murmuring into a phone. Sutton studied Paul's face. You're very calm for a man whose wife is a hostage. I trust you'll keep your word, Paul replied. Sutton chuckled. You always did mistake calculation for trust. Minutes stretched. Travelers passed, oblivious. A child laughed. Somewhere, a gate agent announced a delay. Sutton's man returned, shaking his head once. Sutton's smile faltered. The accounts are real, he said slowly. But the cash isn't where you thought it would be, Paul said calmly. Sutton's eyes hardened. It's gone. Paul didn't deny it. Rage flashed across Sutton's face, quick and ugly. You lied to me. I told you where it was staged, Paul replied. Not where it is now. Sutton's hand snapped up. Two of his men drew weapons. People screamed. Everyone down, someone shouted. Sutton grabbed Carrie, yanking her close, a gun pressed to her side. You think this ends with you tricking me? He snarled. I will paint this floor red if I have to. Paul raised his hand slightly. This doesn't get you what you want. It gets me leverage, Sutton hissed. Because you still care. Paul took another step forward. Let her go. Give me the real location. Paul met his eyes. There is no real location. Sutton's finger tightened on the trigger. The distraction came from the left. A luggage cart slammed into a security barrier, sending metal clanging and bags spilling. A man shouted. Another scream cut through the air as lights flickered. Troy. He moved fast, too fast for someone Sutton hadn't counted. He tripped a breaker panel, plunging part of the concourse into partial darkness, then knocked over a display stand, creating a wave of confusion. Sutton turned instinctively. That was all Carrie needed. She drove her elbow back, hard, then ducked and ran. Get her! Sutton roared. Paul moved. A shot rang out. Pain exploded in his shoulder, hot and immediate, the force spinning him sideways. He hit the ground hard, breath knocked from his lungs. But he kept moving. Paul rolled, came up on one knee, grabbed the leg of the nearest gunman, and pulled. The man went down. Paul drove his weight into him, ignoring the blood soaking his sleeve. Another gunman swung his weapon toward a cluster of civilians. Paul tackled him. They crashed into a row of seats. Paul felt another flash of pain as his injured shoulder screamed, but he twisted, locked the man's arm, and wrenched until the gun clattered away. Security was converging now. Shouts. Sirens. Sutton tried to run. Paul forced himself up and lunged, catching Sutton by the coat. They collided, rolling across the polished floor. You should have stayed buried, Sutton spat. Paul slammed his fist into Sutton's jaw. They grappled, Sutton desperate now, fury replacing control. Paul felt lightheaded, blood loss catching up, but he held on, using leverage, bone against bone. Police swarmed in, weapons raised. Don't move. Sutton froze, chest heaving. Cuffs snapped shut. As he was hauled to his feet, Sutton leaned close to Paul, voice low and venomous. You still don't understand, he whispered. I was never the mastermind. Paul met his gaze, eyes cold. Sutton smiled thinly. You're already too late. They dragged Sutton away. Paul sagged, then felt hands supporting him. Paramedics. Voices. The world narrowed to pain and noise. Paul. Carrie's voice cut through it all. She pushed past responders, face pale, eyes wide. She knelt beside him, hands hovering, unsure where to touch. You're bleeding, she said. I know. Paul replied through clenched teeth. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Paul looked at her, not just at her face, but at the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the security perimeter, the way her breathing steadied too quickly, the way fear seemed to switch off and on like a practice skill. He said nothing. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Paul kept his gaze on Carrie, watching closely, because her reactions didn't fully align with a woman who was merely a victim. Chapter 9, The Architect Revealed. Paul Harper sat in a dimly lit conference room on the 14th floor of a federal building. The hum of fluorescent lights above mixing with the low murmur of agents moving in and out. It had been 3 days since Denver, a blur of hospital hallways, stitches, and interrogations. But this was the first time Paul felt the weight of clarity pressing down on him. Don sat across the table, fingers steepled, reviewing a tablet. Troy hovered near the corner, trying to stay out of the room, but Paul could see his curiosity burning through. Everything we've pieced together, Don began, points to Sutton being a controlled asset. A pawn, not the mastermind. Someone higher, someone with total reach, orchestrated the entire operation. Paul didn't react. He knew that much already. He'd always suspected the orchestration went beyond Sutton, but hearing it confirmed, official and precise, sharpened the edge of his anger. Who? Paul asked. Don swiped the tablet, bringing up a classified image. Karen Jefferson, State Department, Covert Operations Director, Senior Clearance Level. She's been running operations from the shadows for over a decade. Everything traces back to her. Paul's eyes narrowed. She's the one who wanted me destroyed. Precisely, Don said. The fake hospital call, the DNA tests, Troy's facial reconstruction, Sutton's early release and funding. Even Carrie, at certain moments, Karen impersonated her. Every move was designed to manipulate your emotions and actions, to make you appear rogue. Paul's mind raced. Every detail he'd doubted, every coincidence that had unnerved him, now had context. You're telling me that the boy, the hospital, the accident, all of it, Paul said, shaking his head, was engineered by one woman? Yes, Don replied. One of the most powerful people in covert operations. Every twist, every distraction, every piece of misinformation you've encountered, her fingerprints are all over it. Sutton, Browning, the fake journalist, they were instruments. She manipulated the bureaucracy, used government channels, and covered her tracks at every level. Paul leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He pictured the hospital ICU, Troy's face, the chaos at the airport. His shoulders still throbbed, a reminder of the physical toll. But this, the revelation, was worse. So, Paul said slowly, Carrie, when she acted strangely, when she seemed inconsistent, that wasn't her fault? Partially, Don admitted. She was manipulated. Karen staged interactions to make you doubt Carrie's loyalty, her intentions, even her identity at times. She created layers within layers to destabilize you. Psychological warfare. Total control. Troy shifted. Wait, you mean all the times I thought I was helping my mom, that I was making decisions based on her, it was someone else feeding me lies? Paul looked at him. Your mother didn't lie to you. She was used, Troy. She had no choice. But yes, some of what guided you, who you were told to trust, even the journalist, all orchestrated to make you a pawn. Troy swallowed hard. So I'm just a tool? You were manipulated, Paul corrected. But you're more than a tool. You're still you. That's why you survived. That's why you're here. Don tapped the tablet. We traced financial movements, communications, covert transfers. Every piece led back to Jefferson. She ensured the Bosnia cash rumors would resurface. She timed Sutton's release. She ensured Browning's death at the right moment. And Paul's jaw tightened. She impersonated Carrie. Yes, Don confirmed. She inserted herself where it mattered, using convincing disguises, selective exposure, and controlled environments to make you doubt the truth. You acted, reacted, and moved exactly how she predicted. Paul's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. All to make me look rogue. Exactly, Don said. To remove witnesses, discredit you, and secure control over biochemical weapons under the cover of government operations. Paul's mind replayed events like a film. The fake hospital call, the impossible DNA results, Troy's transformation, Browning's death, the airport chaos. Every moment had been guided, manipulated. Every choice he thought he made freely had been anticipated. You know, Paul said quietly. She even thought she could predict my emotions. She assumed my attachment to Carrie would make me predictable. She assumed I would react like a man driven by love instead of strategy. And Don prompted. Paul stared at the ceiling. She underestimated me. She assumed loyalty could be exploited as weakness. She forgot one thing. I don't stop protecting what matters. Troy swallowed again, looking at Paul. So we're not done? Paul shook his head. No, not by a long shot. Sutton is gone. Browning is dead. But Jefferson, she's still out there, orchestrating everything quietly. She isn't a maniac in a basement. She's a ghost in the system. Every move we make now will be scrutinized, but now we know the rules. Don leaned forward. We have the leverage now. Evidence, logs, financial trails. The FBI is on board. She can't move undetected forever. Paul's eyes went cold. She tried to destroy me, Troy. She tried to turn every person I trusted against me. She tried to make me insane. You survived, Don said. And you adapted. Paul looked at Troy. You too. You kept your head, followed instructions, and didn't break. Troy nodded, still processing the revelations. It's a lot to take in. I thought Sutton was the problem. I thought Browning was the villain. But she, his voice faltered. She's everywhere. And she's smart. Intelligent, Paul corrected. Too intelligent to underestimate. But she's also arrogant. She assumes she can control everything because she's unseen. That's her weakness. Dawn flipped through the tablet again. She left trails, evidence, patterns. Every sophisticated system has blind spots. She used them to manipulate us, but we can reverse engineer them. Paul stood, pacing slowly. Every move we've made, every reaction we've had, has been recorded analyzed. Now it's time we do the same. Time we turn her tools against her. Troy's eyes widened. So we fight her. Paul paused and looked at him, voice steady. We do what we have to. She used people as chess pieces, Troy, including you. We make sure the board isn't hers anymore. Don tapped the table, solemn. It's delicate. One mistake, one misstep, and she could vanish again, leaving the chaos behind. Paul nodded, absorbing the weight of that truth. She believed she could frame me as rogue, remove witnesses, and seize the weapons. She underestimated resilience, loyalty, and preparation. She underestimated us. Troy shifted uncomfortably. And Carrie. Paul glanced at her photo, tucked into his jacket. He didn't speak immediately. His mind traced every moment, her abduction, the airport chaos, her subtle inconsistencies. She's been manipulated, but she's alive, and she's on our side. We protect her. First, last, always. Don exhaled. So Jefferson is the endgame. The architect. The one who made all of this happen. Paul leaned back, gaze distant. The one who turned my life into a labyrinth. Every ghost, every lie, every staged event led back to her. We finally know who we're dealing with. Troy swallowed hard. So we know the enemy. Paul nodded slowly, letting the gravity sink in. We know the enemy. For the first time in days, a brittle sense of calm settled over the room. Not victory. Too many pieces were still in motion, but clarity. The invisible hand that had puppeteered their lives had finally been identified. Every manipulated call, staged DNA test, orchestrated face, every stolen government fund, and every engineered death, the web traced back to one woman. Karen Jefferson, the covert ops director, the architect of chaos, and a mastermind who had turned Paul Harper's world upside down. And now, with the mask removed, the real game could begin. Chapter 10. The Son Who Chose Him. The courthouse was quiet, almost antiseptic, but it carried a tension that felt heavier than the air outside. Paul Harper stood near the entrance, hands folded behind his back, watching the agents and attorneys move with precise efficiency. Karen Jefferson was finally being led in, flanked by federal marshals, her confident mask cracked but not shattered. The media cameras, the press, the endless questions, they were irrelevant to Paul. This was about closure, about truth, about reclaiming what had been stolen. Don leaned beside him, arms crossed. It's finally happening, he said quietly. All the threads we traced, the digital footprints, financial transactions, Sutton's testimony, they're collapsing on her. She's finished. Paul nodded, eyes scanning the hallway. He spotted Carrie, seated in the gallery, hands clenched in her lap. She caught his gaze and nodded once, a faint, grateful smile. Relief washed through him. The woman he had feared losing, who had been pulled into Jefferson's web against her will, was finally cleared of suspicion. The evidence made it undeniable. Carrie had been manipulated, not complicit. Troy stood slightly behind Paul, shoulders squared. He wasn't the boy who had been thrust into a nightmare, nor the young man shaped to mimic someone else's image. He was simply Troy, resilient, alert, and determined. Paul could see it in the way Troy held himself, the controlled focus in his eyes, the steady patience of someone who had survived a storm and chosen to stand in the eye of it. "You ready?" Paul asked softly, almost more to himself than to Troy. "I am," Troy replied. His voice carried a calm conviction. "I stay with you." Paul's chest tightened, not because he needed loyalty proven. He already knew Troy's courage, but because this was the choice that mattered. Troy could have walked away, returned to a life that was never his, walked the straight path of ordinary existence. But he didn't. He chose to stay. By blood? Paul asked quietly, almost rhetorically. Troy shook his head. No, by choice. By what we've been through. Paul allowed a small smile. Then that's enough. Inside the courtroom, Jefferson's arrival drew whispers, cameras clicking, and a low murmur of anticipation. She was led to the defendant's bench, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the room as though searching for threats, allies, escape routes. But there were none. Every network she had relied upon, every carefully constructed lie, had unraveled under the meticulous work Paul, Dawn and the federal teams had preserved for years. An attorney approached, shoving a thick folder across the table to the prosecutor. Paul's eyes caught the documents briefly. Financial accounts, covert operation logs, timestamps, altered DNA reports, records of Troy's facial reconstruction surgery, communications intercepted from Jefferson's encrypted devices. Every piece told a story of manipulation, deception, and criminal orchestration. Every piece implicated Jefferson fully. Everything we suspected, Don muttered under his breath, and more. Paul didn't reply immediately. He was thinking back to the days in the cabin, the chaos at the airport, the endless nights training Troy, mapping contingencies, calculating probabilities, preparing for threats that seemed omnipresent. Every step had led to this moment. The collapse of a network, the unraveling of a grand illusion, and the vindication of every choice he had made in defense of those he protected. He glanced at Troy, who had moved closer, standing now at Paul's side, alert and present. Paul's gaze softened slightly. This young man, once a stranger, once a pawn, once a manufactured reflection, had become something real, loyal, brave, and entirely his own. Do you regret it? Paul asked quietly, referring not to Jefferson's capture, but to Troy's decision to stay. Troy shook his head. No, you taught me that loyalty isn't about obligation. It's about trust, and I trust you. Paul's hand brushed Troy's shoulder briefly, a simple gesture, but heavy with unspoken meaning. It was an acceptance of more than allegiance. It was a recognition that family, identity, and loyalty could be forged outside bloodlines. That the bonds born in fire could be stronger than those written on paper. The trial began with the prosecutor presenting the compiled evidence. Jefferson's expression was unreadable at first, but as each document was laid bare, the fraudulent DNA reports, the financial trails funding Sutton and Browning, the manipulated hospital records, the falsified medical procedures for Troy, her calm veneer cracked. Every lie exposed, every manipulation revealed, painted her not just as a rogue operative, but as the architect of a campaign designed to destroy Paul Harper entirely. Paul listened, watching, evaluating. He noted her micro-expressions, the twitch at the corner of her eye, the tight clenching of her jaw, the faint tremor in her fingers. After decades in intelligence, he could read fear, arrogance, and frustration in the smallest shifts. She was losing control. The narrative she had tried to craft, the illusion of omnipotence, was crumbling under scrutiny. Carrie watched silently, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. When Jefferson's manipulations involving Carrie were revealed, the impersonation, the staged interactions, the psychological pressure applied to sway Paul's perception, Carrie's eyes welled, but she remained composed. Relief, anger, and vindication flickered across her face. Troy leaned slightly toward Paul. She thought she could control everything, he whispered. She underestimated what happens when you fight with clarity, Paul said softly. By the afternoon, Jefferson was stripped of cover and influence. She was escorted out under heavy security, her protests and threats muted by procedural authority. For the first time, Paul saw her not as omnipotent, but as exposed, fallible, and finally accountable. Outside the courthouse, the spring air was crisp. Paul, Troy, and Carrie stepped into sunlight that felt almost unreal after weeks of shadowed fear and meticulous preparation. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. The streets were ordinary. People moved without awareness of the battles fought behind the closed doors of the federal building. Paul looked at Troy. You could have walked away. You didn't. Troy nodded. Because someone believed in me, even when the world told me I was just a pawn. Paul's gaze softened. Then consider this officially unofficial. You're not my son, not by blood, but by choice, by loyalty, by everything we endured together. You're exactly what matters. Troy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both relief and newfound purpose. Then I stay, with you, until the end. Carrie stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on Paul's arm. You both survived this because you trusted each other, she said softly. Because you refused to be manipulated any longer. Paul nodded, letting the weight of the words settle. The war on his identity, the fake son, the staged hospital, the manipulated evidence, the threats and traps had finally ended. He could feel the exhaustion and the adrenaline fading into quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not victory, but resolution. Troy looked up at Paul, eyes steady. "So what now?" Paul smiled faintly, surveying the horizon, the streets, the ordinary lives continuing outside the courthouse walls. "Now," he said, "we build, we protect, we live, and we ensure nothing like this ever happens again, not to us, not to anyone we care about." For a long moment, they stood there, three figures in the sunlight, battered but unbroken, tethered not by biology but by choice, by shared struggle, and by trust forged in fire. Paul thought about the lies, the manipulations, the ghosts of his past missions, the carefully engineered chaos designed to break him. He realized that even the most meticulously constructed falsehood could not extinguish loyalty, courage, and resolve. And in Troy, in Carrie, and in himself he saw the proof that even a manufactured life could yield something genuine, something enduring, something real. They walked away from the courthouse together, side by side, not by blood but by bond. And as they disappeared into the ordinary bustle of the city, Paul Harper knew, finally, that he had reclaimed his life and chosen his own family in the process. The past could attempt to manipulate. Lies could be layered and reinforced. Ghosts could be engineered. But loyalty, courage, and choice, those were untouchable. And Troy had chosen him. Paul had chosen Troy in return. And together, they were unstoppable. The sun set on the city skyline, casting long shadows that stretched like echoes of the battles behind them. But ahead lay clarity, truth, and a bond that had survived deception, death, and betrayal. The war on his identity was over. And for the first time in years, Paul Harper could breathe.